Still starting? There, it looks like it's working. Okay, I'll take looks like working any day. Good morning, afternoon, everyone. All right, so we are continuing our work through the book of Bereshit. We began last week with Bereshit itself, which means this week we are on the topic of Noah. Exactly. So Noach is 10 generations from Adam. So if you blinked, you've missed it. We have gone all the way from the first generation of humanity to Noach in the blink of an eye. Not a whole lot happened, at least not a whole lot that we want to record in detail. Because as we're going to see when Noach comes onto the scene, the world's not looking so good. The world is not looking so good. And that's going to kick off our whole narrative. So I'm not going to give you any more spoilers because I don't want to ruin the surprise of what happens in the story of Noah. So we're going to jump right in with both feet into the rising waters, page 41. And we're going to start right at the beginning of Parashat Noach, which is chapter 6, verse 9. And I'm going to need a volunteer who's happy to read and doesn't mind me interrupting them. Thank you.
This is the line of Noah. Noah was a righteous man. He was blameless in his age. Noah walked with God.
All right, so very interesting opening. Right, we know that Noach is somebody who is connected to God. That's what it means to walk with God. And we get this idea that he is a righteous man, that he is Ish Sadiq. And then we get this other phrase, which in this translation is set apart with a semicolon, that he was blameless in his age, that he was tamim, he was flawless, perfect in his generation, would be, I think, a slightly more literal translation, so that we understand that age here doesn't mean like how old you are, but age meaning the time period that he lived in. Good thing. This is what you want as your wall your wall award that you received from the Kawanas, where it says you were, Ish Sadiq, you were a righteous man, and you were blameless in your generations. Yes? No?
No.
In classical tradition. Well, okay, so classical tradition is a little ambivalent about this, right? Because we have two ways of reading this, especially that blameless in your generation. If I was to say, here is Mr. Schmidt, and he lived during World War II, and during World War II, he was a good guy. Am I saying something very praiseworthy about Mr. Schmidt, or am I saying something very reserved about Mr. Schmidt?
Reserved.
It could be reserved, right? Because what I could be saying is, compared to all the Nazis, Mr. Schmidt wasn't so bad. But that leaves open the idea that if you were to put him in the company of people who were not Nazis, maybe Mr. Schmidt would not be so exceptional in his righteousness. Maybe he was good only in comparison. It's like somebody who is, very, very short going to live among the pygmies. All of a sudden, they're going to feel like a giant. And perhaps that was the issue with Noah. The rest of the world was so bad that perhaps he was tamim. Perhaps he was considered this level of perfect or of blamelessness only because of the generations he lived among. On the other hand, let's go back to Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schmidt lived during World War II in Germany. And he lived among the Nazis, and there was incredible political pressure to be part of the Nazi movement. But Mr. Schmidt, praise or reservation? That's high praise, right? If you live among Nazis and you choose not to become one, despite the personal loss or even risk to yourself, well, you know what? Someone else who's righteous at a time or a place where everyone is righteous, they haven't had to exert themselves to be righteous so much. Whereas somebody who lives among evil, who still remains righteous, that's a pretty amazing accomplishment, right? It's the person who is too poor to buy food, we don't give them points for being in shape. Wow, you're in a dress size 0. That's so great. It's like, well, I can't afford food. Right? I didn't diet my way to the dress size 0. It's just the situation I was living in. But somebody who lives in, a bakery and is still able to fit into something that's, what they want to be able to wear, we say, wow, look at that. You live in a bakery and you're surrounded by all these sweets, and yet you have enough self-discipline that you can, not turn yourself into a cupcake yourself. That's higher praise because of the setting. So our ancestors debate, and this debate's going to come back in our later commentary, so I wanted to get that up on the table now. Our ancestors' debate was this comment by God in the Torah meant to praise Noah for being righteous despite the evil around him, or was this meant to limit our celebration of his righteousness because he was only righteous in relative terms? And had he been next to Abraham, he would have been a totally unremarkable man. If he had been next to Moses, he would have been totally unremarkable. And the debate is still going, but we will come back to that as we go. But we need a little more text.
Noah begot 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The earth became corrupt before God. The earth was filled with lawlessness.
Or violence, depending upon how you want to translate the word Hamas.
When God saw how corrupt or violent the earth was, for all flesh had corrupted its ways on earth, God said to Noah, I have decided to put an end to all flesh, for the earth is filled with lawlessness. Because of that, I am about to destroy them with the earth.
All right. So we've got a problem. Noah may be good, but apparently the rest of the world isn't. And God has decided to wipe it out. And he's sharing this information with Noah. We good so far? Maybe? Okay, onward.
Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make it an ark with compartments, and cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. Make an opening for daylight in the ark, and terminate it within a cubit of the top. Put the entrance to the ark in its side. Make it with bottom, second, and third decks.
All right, so we're going to have an ark. Possibly a giant rectangle. Possibly these were the outer dimensions and there was going to be more of a boat shape to it. That's the subject for artists to bicker about. But we have it 30 cubits by 50 cubits, 300 cubits by 50 cubits by 30 cubits. Sound good? No problem?
What's a cubit?
What's a cubit? Thank you. So there is the literal definition, and then there is the approximation that we use. The literal definition is the cubit is the distance from your elbow to the middle of your finger. And the same way that we might say a foot was roughly the distance of a foot, this became standardized more or less, depending upon different archaeology, but it's probably about 18 inches, which is what makes the math easy. So that way you can simply say 450 feet by 75 feet by 45 feet, to put it into something that we can be a little more familiar with. So 450 feet long. So we are looking at something that's longer than a football field, because football fields are 300 feet long, right? So it's a football field and a half, and it is 75 feet. What's something that's similar to 75 feet?
It's about as wide as a football.
About as wide as a football field, sure. I don't actually, how wide is a football field? Okay, and about 45 feet high, 4-story building high. All right, so this is a pretty massive structure, right? This is not a dinghy.
Yeah.
This is a boat that would be considered enormous all the way up until the 18th and 19th centuries. This is not something that would have been typical during the Roman times or the Greek times or any time during the Middle Ages. When Columbus came across the Atlantic, his boat was not this big.
Even all three boats.
Even all three boats together would not have been this big. So this is a massive boat and a massive undertaking for Noach to be working on.
It's like a pocket aircraft carrier.
Yes, I mean, it's. I'm not so sure about the pocket side, but
I mean, it's huge.
but this is a huge, huge structure, and especially when it's being made out of wood. By the way, gopher wood is a literal translation of the Hebrew word. because we're not 100% sure exactly which type of wood that is, but it must have been something pretty good for making boats out of. There are other commentaries that go into more detail, but not for today. Onward. So now we're on verse 17.
For my part, I am about to bring the flood, waters upon the earth, to destroy all flesh under the sky in which there is breath of life. Everything on earth shall perish. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall enter the ark with your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives. And of all that lives, of all flesh, you shall take 2 of each into the ark to keep alive with you. They shall be male and female. From birds of every kind, cattle of every kind of creeping thing on earth, 2 of each shall come to you to stay alive. For your part, take of everything that is eaten and store it away, to serve as food for you and for them.
All right, pause there. God finishes his speech. Right, the speech began way back over on page 42 in verse 13, and now he's finished. And in the speech, we've got the description of the ark, and we've got the description of the purpose of the ark, which is that this is going to be a vessel that will carry 2 of every kind of animal. Now, we do see in later chapter that God is also going to be sending 7 pairs of the clean animals, ritually clean animals, which is an important thing to keep in mind when we get to the very end of the flood and Noah offers a sacrifice, because if he had not had extras of those animals, then his sacrifice would have been extinction. So it's an important little thing to keep in mind. But the basic point being that this 450, 75 by 45 boat is going to be filled with an awful lot of animals, and is going to be filled with an awful lot of food, right? With a lot of food. And we're not going to go into the full account here, but the tradition reads through this description of the flood itself and works out that from the time the waters began to rise and all the animals had to be on board until Noah was able to finally open the door and let all of them off was about a year. So they had both animals there for a year, and they had food for the animals for a year. I can see people looking uncomfortable because everybody loves sharing their house with animals for a year, right? And wouldn't you just love to have nowhere else to go? So maybe for a swim. It sounds rather impressive. It also sounds rather difficult. And we might even ask the question, is this plausible? Right. Now, we went into more of the plausibility, I believe, in last year. If it wasn't last year, it was the year before's lecture on Noach. But there is something unsettling about all of this. And there's many things that are unsettling. We're going to focus on one in particular. And that one in particular is that God asked Noah to do this. Right? Isn't that a little bit odd?
Yeah.
Maybe?
God could have given him a yacht and recreated all the animals.
Right.
A lot easier.
Why go through the arkish rigmarole? Why not cut out the middleman? Why not start from scratch? Right? Just hit the full reboot button rather than this soft reboot. There seems to be a number of questions about all of this, and there's also a number of questions about Noah himself, of why he was involved and what was his involvement. Because as we see, and I'm just going to have you read one more line in the Torah, as we see from verse 22, when God has given all of these instructions, finally we hear Noah's response.
Noah did so. God commanded him, so he did it.
He did it. He did it. Done.
Mm-hmm.
Which, if you look ahead on the next page, the next thing we find is that the flood's happening. So we see nothing else in between.
But first, he gets a really nice compliment.
Yeah,
words of encouragement.
Yes, he is told why he's being selected, at least to a certain degree, which is nice, and
Very, very encouraging.
Gets
The voice of God come to
the
you.
plaque on the wall, it's
The
nice.
voice of God come to you and say,
Because we all know how much we enjoy being volunteered for something. Yes.
Does he question God? I can't remember. Does he question God?
We see no questioning of Noah of what God is doing. And that is going to come back in our discussion. right? So what God has asked and the way that God is asking this, and Noah's response or lack of response, apart from carrying out the deed, is something that has provoked commentary for a few thousand years. We're not going to look at every commentary because we don't have a few thousand years, but we are going to look at a few, especially ones that were brought by Rabbeinu Bachya, a great sage who synthesized many of the other commentaries and wove them together in a way that I think will help us touch on many of the important issues. So we're first going to start off at the very, very top on our handout, where it says, when one considers.
When one considers the many types of species Noah had been asked to bring into the ark, these measurements appear to be totally insufficient. In fact, according to the number of species of animals and birds in our world today, even 10 times as many arks of that size would not be able to accommodate them all.
All right, pause real quick. Anybody here ever been to a zoo? Yes, of course you have. Has anybody ever been to a zoo that was just as long as a football field times 50%? That's it.
Yeah, it didn't have much in it.
What?
It didn't have much in
It
it.
didn't have much in it. I went to a zoo like that. Sure, it was a petting zoo. I mean, there was a couple llamas and a goat. This space, as is being described here, is insufficient for the number of animals that we know. I mean, even one of each animal would not fit in a volume that was this size.
Levels. We had 3 levels.
Exactly right. Okay, so 3. So that would be we have 1.5 times 3. It's a 5 football fields. That would be sufficient.
Maybe.
And there's cages.
For every animal in the world. I mean, for 2 of each animal.
Plus
Yeah.
a year's worth of food.
Your years are proof, yeah.
Maybe there weren't that many species. I mean, it was the beginning.
It was the beginning, but remember, it was 10 generations from the beginning. It wasn't like it had just been made yesterday.
But maybe it takes longer for those to evolve.
Could be. But as you can see, our traditional commentator is puzzled by the volume, because when he's looking around at his community and saying, you know, cow, sheep, goat, bird, that type of bird, that type of bird, that type of bird, that type of wild animal, that type of deer, that type of rabbit, that type of mouse, he's already going, wait a minute. If I wouldn't be able to put these animals that I know of in this, but let alone a couple elephants, a few hippopotamuses, a couple rhinoceroses, you know, even leaving out the giant dinosaur type thing. It's pretty, 10 times this volume, we probably still wouldn't be able to fit 2 of each.
We did this, Rabbi Lynn.
This, if I remember, because I seem to have somehow left off his title, so I'm a little worried about which one he was, because somehow I forgot to put that quote. I believe that was Fiskuni, who's from the Middle Ages.
Okay.
So, yeah, it's someone who was early enough that they're not puzzled by many things, but he's bringing this point to make he's bringing this calculation to make a very important point, which is the second half.
There can therefore be no doubt that the entire operation was possible only by means of God's miraculous intervention. God demonstrated that even a physically small space can accommodate a great number of creatures when God so decrees it.
All right, the Ark was a TARDIS. If you know Doctor Who, the TARDIS is a thing in a science fiction show where it's bigger on the inside than the outside. Right, so there had to be a miracle. That's what he's trying to say here, is that there's no physical way in our world that you could put 2 of every species, let alone 7 of the clean species, that were going to fit in a 450 by 75 by 45 box. It's just wouldn't work, especially then if you're adding in food. I mean, imagine the amount of food you need to feed 2 elephants for a year. Just that alone would probably not fit inside of this space. Therefore, it was a clown car, right? As all the animals went into it, they were somehow being kept in this multi-dimensional, spatial anomaly, magical, miraculous structure that just, because otherwise there's no way it would work.
It's like watching an old Western where they show a picture of a little shack,
Mhm.
and then the scene from inside, suddenly it's a full-size house.
Exactly, because the prop department couldn't build a full-size house, but they had a studio set that was a full-size house already built.
From the outside, it looked like that.
Exactly.
Once you got in it,
suddenly there's extra room, right? And it's just like if you've ever seen like an episode of Friends. Like, who in the world lives in an apartment that size in New York except for millionaires, right? But it worked for the studio because that's what you need when you have the cameras walking around. You need that extra room. So the ark was somehow miraculously expanded inside beyond its external structure. So somehow when Noah drove the final peg in and opened up the door, all of this endless chain of animal comes in and it happens to all fit. It's a miracle. Like, there's no other explanation.
Rashi has another take on this. He says that Hashem knew that the animals are not going to fit in it, but that was not the idea. The idea is to build it so that people will see it.
So here comes our question that's going to be hanging over us for much of the rest of our discussion, which is, if the ark is going to have this miraculous interior that allows other things to survive in it despite being too small of a space, why do you need an ark? Why not build a shed, right? And just have the animals walking. Why not build a dinghy, right? Build a 6 foot by 6 foot box or whatever box you need to house the largest animal, and just miraculously they can all file in and everything will be fine. Or why bring food? If we're already resorting to a miracle of fitting them in 450 by 75 and 45, and if let's include the giraffes, if a 30 by 30 by 30 box would have been sufficient for any one animal that we wanted to save, why did we need to build anything? Why did we need to include food? Why was this such a thing? And Rashi's answer is going to come up in our discussion, which is that the building itself was important. So let's get this story, this commentary going. So now I know we're definitely in Rabbeinu Bachya.
You may be inclined to ask that seeing God was able to save all these people and animals by working a miracle, why did he bother to command Noah to spend 120 years of his life to build the ark altogether? Surely God had a number of other alternatives once he had decided to invoke miracles. For instance, he could have enabled the people and animals who were meant to survive to walk on water, or some other miracle not involving 120 years of Noah's time and labor.
It's such a sensitive comment because it's going, poor Noah, right? He finishes building this and he looks out and here comes the line of animals that God has arranged to meet him. And he looks back at the ark and he's like, there's no way that's all going to fit. And all the animals go on and he realizes a miracle is happening that lets them all fit. And then he goes, well, wait a minute. If you were just going to use a miracle to make them all fit, why did I have to build that? I could have built the tiny little box, right? And let them all walk on water. 120 years of my life, sawing and planing and gluing and hammering, and you just make a miracle at the end. Really, God? It's like if you've ever been working with someone who perhaps was much better at a skill than you were. Maybe you were working on an essay, maybe you were doing something with like a photo edit or something, and you have a friend who shows up and says, oh, here, I can help you do that. And they go click, 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 boom, and it's done. And it's like, I just spent 3 hours banging my head trying to get this to where it was. And you step in and flip 2 switches, and it looks better than all my 3 hours was able to produce. Why did I bother spending those 3 hours doing that? I should have just called you in the first place and said, you do it. We've all had that feeling at some point in our life where we're just like, why did I bother? I should have just let that person.
So was it a test of faith?
Okay, so why would it be needed? Thank you. So, but notice that our commentators, right, our sages for the last couple thousand years, they've been asking these questions because they were willing to do the math and they were willing to look at the natural world around them and they were willing to say, it doesn't add up, right? If one animal plus one animal equals a whole lot of animals, and this is not big enough for that whole lot here, and if something's going on, there has to be a reason. So here is one explanation for why it might have been done like this. Onward for the second paragraph.
The answer to such questions is that the Torah always instructs man to do all in his power to achieve his objective by natural means.
All right, so let's make sure we got that and understand it and let it sit with us. That when the Torah asks us to do something, even at the same time that it's being promised that it'll be blessed by God and supported by God, we have to do everything we can within natural means, saws, hammers, and glue, to make it happen. We don't get to say, oh, well, if God said it's going to happen, then
we don't get to sit back
yeah,
and watch.
I'll
take a movie.
Right, exactly. We don't get to say a miracle will take care of it. We have to use all of our capacity to try and do it as much as possible. Again, to use another analogy, if you've had children who've worked on homework projects and such, as a parent, you don't want them to fail. But as a parent, you wait for them to get all the way to the limit of what they can do before you then say, okay, let me help you do this little part to finish it off. Right? Okay, I'll type it up for you. Back in the days when typing was a thing, right? Or okay, I'll help you, take care of the bibliography because I can see that's confusing for you. Or okay, this question in your algebra homework, that I can see maybe you don't understand, so let me walk you through it. But the others, I want to let you sit there and struggle and work on it because you need to know that you have to put in 100% of your effort, and then I'll put the cherry on top. But if you don't put the 100% down there, I'm not putting the cherry. It has to have all of you before I can put any of me. He explains further.
If for reasons beyond his control, man cannot complete his task, God will supply the amount of miracle needed to bring man's deserving endeavor to a successful conclusion.
All right, so I make a reference here to Ramban, who unfortunately I couldn't get on the page together with all the other things I wanted. But Ramban brings this beautiful idea, this beautiful expression that God always wants to minimize the miraculousness. God wants to minimize, it's the minimal necessary miracle is what God is always using. Right? It's like the minimum force needed. So if you need the miracle to be the parting of the sea, fine, then we'll part the sea. But if God could have taken us out of Egypt without parting the sea, then the sea would not have parted. The minimum miracle needed is what God is looking for. He wants to minimize the miracle and maximize human agency. And the miracle is just there and only there to take care of that which we could not have done ourselves.
If you will examine other miracles reported in the Torah, you will always find that though God intervened in the most miraculous manner, there were always elements in what happened which were based on the laws of nature being made full use of. All
right, so it's miraculous that these things happened, but it's not as miraculous as it could have been because somehow, in some way, in every miracle, some natural element played a part. And if God wanted to be super duper 100% only miracle, then nature would have not had any part to play. It would have just been entirely by divine fiat that this thing happened.
For instance, when the Torah commanded the 2.5 tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh to join their brethren in war, this was not because they did the actual fighting.
No, they did fight, don't get me wrong.
The actual fighting was done by God. Nonetheless, man has to do or to appear to do whatever is within his power to try and achieve the task set for him by God. Similarly, we find in Joshua chapter 8, verse 2, that God commanded Joshua to set an ambush against the city of Ai. The reason is, as we have stated, that God does not intervene by means of a miracle until man has done his duty by trying to help himself.
All right, but we're going to pause there for a second before we get to the additional reason. There's always more than one reason. But I want to make sure that we understand this. Right? When soldiers go out to the front line, the victory, especially in the wars, the early conquest of the land of Israel, the victory wasn't because we were the mightiest army, because we knew that we were not the mightiest army. God says very clearly that I took you out of Egypt and made you my people, even though you are the smallest of nations. So you might ask yourself, if we're the smallest of nations and our army is pretty pathetic compared to the iron chariots of the Canaanites and the Egyptians behind us, then why do I need to show up to work if I'm a soldier? Right? Let one guy walk in front and God's just going to clear the way, and it's going to be a miracle anyway, so let it be a miracle. Why should I get out of bed? And this is saying because you have a duty to show up and do your part. And yes, when your part is insufficient, the miracle can come to round it out and make sure that you make the extra success.
Well, in the battle
Mhm.
that they mention here, it was a cleverness and deception
Absolutely.
that was used to win that battle.
Right. And I think his choice of the ambush as being one of the examples is very clear.
So we have the mental, it isn't just physical challenge,
Yes.
it's a mental challenge to figure a way to utilize what we do have.
All of our abilities,
Yes.
right? If you believed, just as a spurious example, but just it's easy to think about, if you believe that God wanted to bless you to be rich, there at a slot machine saying, one of these days, God is going to help me be rich because God will bless me. And all I need to do is keep pulling this lever. No, you got to use your brain too. And your brain will tell you, this is not the most reliable way to become wealthy in life. That, yes, God may want to give you a miracle, but he's not going to reward you just for pulling a stick. He will reward you for using all of your capacity to seek the goal that is right now. Whether or not seeking the goal of being wealthy is the highest priority in life, yes, that's a whole nother discussion. But hopefully it's just at least a simple analogy that you can see.
But it also implies that we need to educate and we need to, I mean, there's so many things. This is like.
You need to educate, you need to
incredible
educate, you need to protect, you need to help, you need to heal, all of these things.
All of these
You don't just say
The commentary gets better.
even
It's
better.
even better.
Yes, but I just want to leave that one last topic about healing, right? Because this is one place where people will often turn to God, is when there is an illness. They will turn, even if they haven't asked God to help them with their career, even if they didn't ask God to help them with their, with their family life. When someone is sick, they will often turn to God at that point. What I'm saying here is, yes, miracles are possible, but that doesn't mean you don't go to the doctor. Right? That doesn't mean you don't take your medicine. That doesn't mean you don't do physical therapy. That doesn't mean you don't do everything else that's needed in order to 100% live up to your part of taking care of what needs to be done. And it certainly doesn't mean when someone comes knocking at your door saying, I'm sick, I need help, you don't tell them, go pray harder. Right? I'm sure God will take care of you. You say, okay, I need to take care of you. And yes, whatever I lack, then I can hope for a miracle to take care of. But I have to do everything that is in my power to help you, to help myself, to help others who are sick. All right. And let's bump it up a notch.
There was an additional reason why God had commanded Noah to build it. He had hoped that when people would watch the vast amount of time and energy which Noah put into constructing this huge ark, that he must have known what he was doing, and that at least some people would take his warning of the impending deluge to heart to repent and change their lifestyle. If they would, nonetheless, ignore such warnings, they were obviously irredeemable sinners and would deserve whatever God decreed for them.
All right, so 120 years, building this giant, bigger than a football field thing, is a giant neon sign alerting everyone around you, something big is coming, something big is happening. You need to do something to avoid that from happening.
Reminds me of a conversation we had some weeks ago about we are sometimes the only Torah, the only Bible some people see. Sometimes the best sermon is one that's delivered without words.
Right, it's just living in a particular way. An example.
Such a great rabbi here, such a great teacher, he doesn't even need to speak.
His hammer and his saw speaks.
That's his voice.
Right, and this is also helping us, for those of us that were uncomfortable that Noach didn't say anything, is that by what Noach was doing, his actions were meant as a flare gun up into the sky to let everyone know there's danger here. Things need to be improved. And just in case they're not improved, I'm doing this. But we could avoid it if we change how things are going. And we're going to talk about that avoidance and more as we move on. But first, we're going to do a little bit of a reprisal of what we just said, again, referring back to Rashi, as Yerach had mentioned before. But then Chizkuni is going to take an issue with the way Rashi described that, of he built it as a symbol just to get people to repent.
Rashi asked the rhetorical question that, seeing that God has unlimited space at his disposal, why did he choose such a compact little ark in which to coop up all the creatures he meant to save? His answer is that if mankind would constantly see that Noach was totally preoccupied with the construction of this ark as a means to ride out the deluge, perhaps they would take this to heart and become penitents.
All right, so this is based on Tanhuma, one of the Midrash collections, which is also based on Sanhedrin in the Talmud.
Our author finds this difficult, seeing that God had known his hopes would be disappointed, and that was hardly a reason to make life in the ark so uncomfortable for all the creatures in it.
All right, so we're going to pause there to make sure we understand his objection. So his objection is twofold. One of it is he doesn't quite see the ark as being this multidimensional TARDIS that anything could fit in comfortably. He still sees it as being small for the amount of animals that would have been put into it. And so he's thinking there's a big inconvenience here. There is a little bit of suffering of being cramped into this ark with all of the world. So it would have been nicer if it had been made bigger. And, or just, somehow had been done differently, a different form of salvation. But his real point here is God already knew it wasn't going to work, right? God knew that Noah was going to be out there 120 years, slaving away, building this giant thing, which he would be cramped in, and it wasn't going to make a lick of difference. That the wicked people were still going to be wicked. And that it would be a complete waste as far as a marketing effort goes. And Noah may not have known that, but God certainly did. So if God knew that this giant symbol was not going to convince anybody to repent and would only make life difficult for Noah, both in the building as well as in the living in, why bother? His answer is...
He therefore prefers to answer the question in a different manner. He claims that God wanted to show the attribute of mercy, that he had done all in his power to encourage the people to stave off disaster when they saw how seriously Noach took God's warning. In chapter 7, verse 12, Rashi himself mentions this attempt by God to stave off disaster, by God initially allowing rain, which was not accompanied by storms and subterranean sluices opening, to serve as an additional warning. God did all this to convince the attribute of mercy that further delay was quite useless.
Okay, so first of all, we have to work through a semi-psychological understanding that's being used here as an underpinning, but we can eventually get past that, I hope. Right, so there's a psychological underpinning here, which is that God is almost arguing with himself. That his attribute of justice says the world is evil. The world needs to be destroyed. And his attribute of mercy says, no, they might get better. And how do you reconcile that? When do you know that you've given enough mercy that it's now time for justice to take its course? And his position is that 120 years of building it was enough time for the attribute of mercy to say, all right, after 120 years, and after just a little storm like the one we've got going now, just some rain falling, but it's not like the sluices are opening up from the ground, and it's not like there's a massive storm, and they're still not saying, oops.
It slows anger.
It slows anger, exactly. That mercy is what leads off, because the last thing God wants is strict justice. But God wants mercy, and God wants, therefore, we to act in a way that will give enough time and will give enough lead of instruction and guidance that will inspire people to do better. Right, so our first response to seeing somebody doing wrong is not to punch them in the face. Our first response to seeing somebody is not to castigate and throw them down and throw them, throw the book at them, as they say. Our first response is to try and figure out a way that we can change them for the better. But mercy is how you lead. You don't lead with justice. You lead with mercy. And eventually, yes, justice becomes necessary when mercy has not produced results. But justice is always secondary to mercy. And this is not a lesson to get past the internal psychology of God that Chizkuni is positing here. This is not just a lesson for how God works. This is a lesson that God wants us to embody. So God was not building the ark over 120 years with Noach slaving away and making it in this very awkward form in order to teach the people of that generation. He was doing it in that way to teach the people of our generation. that we need to do likewise. If there's a problem in the world, if there's a problem people in the world, we start like this and build in a way that can hopefully guide them in. Because these people may have been irredeemable, but that doesn't mean everybody who's wrong is irredeemable. Make sense? Okay, onward.
At this point, an intelligent child must surely ask, how is it possible that a man whom the Torah described in the most glowing terms as a righteous and perfect individual did not turn to God in prayer in order to help save the members of his generation and give them a chance to repent and rehabilitate themselves? Why did he not engage God in a dialogue as Abraham did after him when God had informed him that he was going to destroy the city of Sodom and its inhabitants? Abraham had prayed repeatedly and almost insistently, as we know from the report of the Torah in Genesis chapter 18.
All right, so this was your question at the beginning. Noah just did what he was told. He didn't pray. He didn't ask. Even a child would say, wait, we have the example of Abraham, who for Sodom and Gomorrah, which was only like one little area, wasn't even the entire world, was willing to go toe to toe, arguing with God, saying, will the judge of all the earth not do justice, and to barter with God, to reduce the number of righteous people that would be needed in order to save that land. And Noah does nothing except pick up the hammer? That's the question. And here's the answer.
Noah did not neglect to pray for his contemporaries, either because he did not care or felt that they deserved to perish.
All right, so it's important to recognize that Rabbeinu Bachia's opinion is that, yes, Noah did not go into deep prayer mode the same way Abraham did, but he didn't fail to pray because he was uncaring, and he didn't fail to pray because he thought they deserved it. Right, which means if you ever think that there's a person that you could pray for to help them, even though that they're bad, but you think, bah, I don't care about them, that's not a good reason not to pray. Or if you think they deserve to be punished, why should I pray that they change their life? That's not a good reason to avoid praying for them, right? Yes, that person is a creep. Yes, that person is a jerk. Yes, that person is bad. I'm going to pray that they change their life. And if they don't, justice will hopefully catch up to them and things will be taken care of. But I'm going to start off by caring about them because they're a human being created in the image of God, no matter what they've done to that image in their life. And I'm going to pray on their behalf because I don't want them punished. I want them redeemed.
Noah knew that there was a need for only 10 righteous people in order to ensure the survival of the world. He based this on the 10 directives God used to create the universe. All right,
pause there real quick because there's some little assumptions that Rabbeinu Bachya is making in this that may not be 100%. So he knew that you only need 10 people for the world to be saved. How does he know you only need 10 people? Well, because the world was made with 10 utterances. Where do we know that the world was made with 10 utterances? Bereshit, first chapter of Bereshit. Right? If you count up the number of times where it says, and God said, you get 9. And then you add in, and God created at the very beginning, Bereshit bara, and you have 10. So God made the world with 10 utterances. And therefore, for each statement, if you have one person that's living up to that, one person that is representing that statement of God, that's good enough. 10 people and the world should never be destroyed, which is an incredibly optimistic viewpoint. That the entire world, all 9 or whatever we have now, 8 billion, 7 billion people, right? Everybody could be bad, but if there were 10 people, think about the people you know. If you know 10 good people, or 9 if you include yourself as being good, right? If, it's a big if, depending upon how you feel about yourself today. World to keep going, right? It is good enough, even if the other 99.99% were bad, and reason enough for the world to keep spinning and the sun to keep rising, and for us to keep trying. And that was what Noah was faced with. He had that idea, that feeling, that knowing that all you need are 10. But then, unfortunately, he does the math.
Noach reasoned that if there were indeed 10 righteous people alive at that time, God would not have instructed him to prepare for the deluge.
Right? The fire alarm doesn't go off when there isn't fire.
circumstances, only 8 people had been commanded to enter the ark.
His wife and their wives.
Exactly, right? 3 sons, 3 wives, that's 6. Noah and his wife, that's 2 more, 8 people. So God gave that list to him. Take who you want on the ark. God said, this is who's going with you on the ark. Realize you've got 8. And if you've got 8, you don't have 10. And by the way, something very similar happened, although you may not have read commentary that points it out, to Sodom and Gomorrah. When God leaves Abraham in the conversation at the level of 10, when you get down into the land of Sodom, and Lot is trying to convince his family to get out, in the end, only 3 of them make it.
Yeah.
Right? Only 3 actually make it, and we find out they're not so great. But that's another R-rated story. But the fact is that when we get to Sodom and Gomorrah and we see the experiences there, and we do the math that even if all of Lot's family had been good, there still would not have been 10 people. And so therefore, Abraham and all of his arguing was right to argue, but God was right in the sense that there weren't even 10. And so he saved the ones that were worth saving-ish, and unfortunately the rest were left behind. And Noah is experiencing a similar circumstance. It's just at the beginning of the story rather than at the end in the Abraham one. At the beginning of the story, Noah knows there aren't 2 other people. There are only the 8 of us. Because if there were 2 other people, God would have told me to take them too. And if there were 2 other people, God would not have told me to build the ark because the world wouldn't be being destroyed. Okay.
Seeing that there were no 10 good people left on earth, it was clear to him that the generation did not merit survival on account of the remaining 8 good people.
All right, pause real quick. I just want to point out before we get to this next section that in the definition of what are righteous people for whom the world can be saved, there is no gender distinction. Because we're talking about 8 righteous people, but still being short, half of those people were women. Right? It was 4 guys, 4 gals, and unfortunately there were 2 people short of a minion, 2 people short of righteous, but both men and women counted towards that count. They just happened to come up short. But it wasn't that they came up short because they didn't count the women. They came up short because there just weren't enough people, not of a particular gender. Just a little aside.
Under the circumstances, the most that God was willing to do was to save Noah, seeing that he was the first member of the 10th generation of mankind. God accommodated Noah by also saving his immediate family. God is not in the habit of decreeing doom unless the potential victims had first been warned.
Which is a very interesting ending for him to have on this commentary. But let's make sure we have this basic idea that the 10th generation is where I began by saying that Noah was from the 10th generation from Adam. And basically God had waited until that point to see whether humanity was going to get it right. When they didn't, he took the first of the new group that was good, the only one that was good, and said, all right, you are going to be the start of the next segment, the next trial period, if you will. And that is why he picked this particular point as the cutoff period for having been long enough.
Yes? And also how he decrees doom.
Yes.
120 years of, you have no curiosity, why is this?
Right. And the rains didn't come all at once, drowning everyone instantly. They rose over a period of 40 days, 40 nights. You had time.
A person would say, why are these things happening? Why is this being done?
And occasionally someone in dire circumstances might even be willing to admit, you know what? Maybe the reason all these bad things are happening is because we've created a really bad society. Right? Well, why is that guy hitting me? Well, maybe that's because I stole something from him yesterday. Most of us can put 2 and 2 together. This generation could not. Even under the most painfully obvious setting, they couldn't figure out that their evil needed to stop. And, evil's fun. I remember there was I think it was George Carlin, but it might have been one of the other stand-up comedians who was saying, whenever someone gets up there and says, just say no to drugs, right? Just say no to drugs because drugs are bad. It's like, has never tried drugs. Because if you try drugs, The drugs make you feel good. That's why people get addicted. It's because it has a chemical effect on you. And so too evil. Right? People don't do evil because it hurts themselves. They do evil because in some way, shape, or form, they feel a little better having done whatever rotten thing it is they're doing. And that gets you stuck in that rut, which is why mercy is the predominant form rather than justice, and which is why God sends warning before doom, because sometimes people are so deep in that horrible cesspool that they've made for themselves that they can't hear the warning bells unless it's 120 years long and 450 feet long. And why?
Do you think people were trying to steal his construction materials?
I wouldn't.
The added problem with all this,
I wouldn't be surprised.
You know, so you know, putting up with 120 years. Can't we speed this up?
Right.
You know, these awful neighbors.
And I can't speak exactly in the name of the one who said it, but there is another commentary. I wish I'd had room, and I wish I remembered the name of the rabbi who gave it, that says actually it was Noah who made it take 120 years long. That Noah deliberately delayed construction of the ark because he knew that once he finally finished it, the flood would come. And so oh, where's my hammer? I can't find my hammer today. I seem to have run out of nails.
Then he would be witnessing the death of.
So
that has to be traumatic.
And that's traumatic. That's traumatic.
And actually, that is going to be part of my sermon this coming Shabbat. Is the effect of the flood on Noah himself and his reaction after the flood. So if you want to know more about part B to the story, or I guess that would be part C. Part B is the floating part.
A little PTSD.
There are some definite indications of things like that, but also some different moral instruction. Yeah, but the drunkenness is the biggest sign, but we're not going to focus on that as much as some of the other actions that often get glossed over. But this idea that there has to be warning before there is doom, if it is God's decree, is something that extracted from this particular text is an important phrase to have in mind. Meaning, in addition to our own lives, if that we want to punish or somehow reprimand someone, they had to have been given a warning first, right? You don't fire the employee without having told them that what they're doing is unacceptable and giving them a chance to fix their behavior. Unless it's criminal, and then yes, we do usually make an exception there. You don't, as a teacher, fail a student on a test if you did not teach them that material and tell them that they would eventually be tested on this material. But on the other side, when one person is suffering, or a city or a nation, you do not assume that it is divine punishment unless there was an explicitly divine warning. And that's something that's very important to hold in mind, because when disaster strikes, far too often people will say, this is God punishing, blah, 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 blah. We don't get to do that ex post facto. If you want to believe that God is about to punish because of some crime, then God has to make that very, very clear before the punishment happens, in order that mercy has its chance to run its course. You don't get to pin the blame after the effect, not on yourself, nor on others. Sometimes bad things happen because other bad people choose to do them. And sometimes bad things happen because the world we live in is a fragile, complicated network of weather systems, for example, that can lead to things that are not terribly comfortable for the human body. That does not mean that everything bad that happens was a divine punishment. Because if you didn't hear a warning, this was not a punishment. Good. Thank you very much.
Great.